The next day there was a wedding celebration in the village of Canaan in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, that's not our problem," Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." But his mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, "Fill the jars with water." When the jars had been filled, he said, "Now dip some out and take it to the master of the ceremonies." So the servants followed his instructions. When the master of the ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants knew, he called the bridegroom over. "A host always serves the best wine first," he said. "Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine. But you have kept the best until now." This miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Good morning. Thank you for joining us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. As we get started today, I want to take a step back. You see, when I introduced this series, I started with this assumption, but I feel like I might have gotten a little bit ahead of myself. I took some time this week to think back and to reflect about why I personally made the decision to follow Jesus. I believe that the main reason that I'm a Christian right now is because I've seen Jesus change people's lives. He definitely changed my life. I'm very aware of my struggles and my dysfunction. And I know that because of my relationship with Christ, there's a huge difference in the way that I have been able to love my wife Trista or raise my children and even deal with folks on a daily basis. I put my trust in Christ when I was young, and I had this great benefit of being raised in a Christian home. But I don't want you to think for a single moment that I didn't struggle or have moments and times of doubt or live through my own times of rebellion. What I mean is, when I look back on my life, I realize that my relationship with Jesus has indelibly shaped how I think about those most important questions that we ask. Who am I? What's really important? What's worth living for? What happens when I die? I've personally seen Jesus deeply affect the answers to each and every one of those questions. That's why I follow him. And that's why I want to introduce him to others so they can follow him as well. I love doing ministry even in those weeks that it is frustrating and difficult. And I love it because I get the chance to have a front row seat to see what Jesus is doing in other people's lives, to watch what God is still doing in the hearts and the lives of others. I still love baptism because I believe it's this wonderful illustration of how Jesus transforms people as we're buried with him and rise up to walk in a newness of life. And I get to be with people that really love the table because it's a place where we're reminded that our leader invites us to follow him. I really hope today that you have already claimed Jesus as your leader, that you have also witnessed that beautiful act of redemption in your own life. I really hope that you want to live your life following his lead. But I think there's another reason that I personally made the choice to follow Jesus. This morning, our text comes from a guy who not only claimed Jesus as his leader, but he really longed for other people to welcome Jesus as leadership in their lives as well. John writes his gospel with this laser focus in order that we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, we would have life through him. Every stroke of John's pen points to the fact that Jesus is perfectly suited to be able to lead us because he cares for us. John loved Jesus. His life was transformed by Christ. He saw all of the miraculous things that Jesus did while he was here on earth. And John desperately wanted other people to know who Jesus was and what he did so that we also might claim him as our leader. You need to understand, John's not merely writing a historical record, he's writing an invitation. He wants us to come and to know Jesus. That's probably why the first sign or miracle that Jesus performs in his gospel sets the scene for what God's doing. Jesus comes into our problems and our struggles in order to show us his grace and his love. I think to understand the importance of the miracle, you've got to understand the setting and the problem that's happening there. You see, Jesus is at a wedding in this inconspicuous little town just outside of Nazareth. Weddings were and are a really big deal in the Jewish culture. They have all of this tradition and protocol that's supposed to be followed. Like if the bride was a virgin, the wedding occurred on a Wednesday night. But if the bride was a widow, the wedding happened on a Thursday. The wedding ceremony would often take place late in the evening. The father would take the arm of his daughter and he would walk her through the town with the wedding party in tow. They would parade through the streets of the village so that people could come out of their house and congratulate the bride on her new family. Finally, that wedding party would get to the home of the groom, where the wedding would take place outside at the front door of the groom's house. It was this time of great celebration that includes the bride and the groom walking together through the streets, being accompanied by torches with their attendants keeping a canopy over their heads. And the wedding party always took the longest route through the village so that as many people as possible could come out and congratulate and wish that new couple well in their lives. They were treated like royalty. I mean, they actually dressed in fancy robes, and a lot of them would wear crowns on their heads. And then when the ceremony was over, the bride and groom didn't go off on a honeymoon like we do today. Instead, the newlyweds stayed at home for a week. They hosted this come and go open house party, and all of their friends and neighbors were invited. You see, in those days, there's so much poverty and so much hard work and so little time for fun that this week of festivity and joy was the highlight of the community. Everybody looked forward to it. It was really a big deal. So for a moment, I want you to think about all of the things that could go wrong at a wedding. Maybe the best man faints, or maybe a fight breaks out among the new in-laws, or maybe somebody forgets, or worse, loses the rings. But short of the bride or the groom not showing up for the wedding, we have no idea the amount of panic that's about to happen in this little village. Hospitality in the ancient East was a sacred duty. Failure to provide hospitality for your guests was a terrible humiliation for the families involved. That wedding would be the talk of the town for years to come. And so we think that Mary probably had an important role in that wedding. She seems to be acting kind of like a wedding coordinator. And we think that because she's overly concerned when the wine runs out, and she has the authority to tell the servants, do whatever Jesus tells you to do. So we believe there's some kind of connection between the bride and groom and the family of Christ. But what's important for this part of the story is that this is a major event with far more public implications than what most of us are likely used to. John lets us know pretty quickly in the story that there is a problem in this little town. And the problem is that the wine runs out. I like to think about it like we're hosting an important public party at our own home, only to learn that before the guests arrive, all the water's turned off, or our air conditioner breaks, or the bathroom's back up. All of those works and preparations are going to be ruined because I'm going to spend all of my time thinking about what are other people thinking about. And yet today we don't have the same kind of shame culture they had that was prevalent during the time of Jesus. But there's even more going on here than just public humiliation. We're told by New Testament scholars that the responsibility for the wedding feast laid at the feet of the groom, and a failure to adequately provide for the party attenders, the celebrants, could result in a sizable financial issue between the families. Gifts would have been taken back, and there are even times that they would have sued the groom and his family. So this is not a small issue. This is a major problem. So Mary does the only thing she could do. She goes to Jesus. I'm afraid that Mary understands something that we often forget. She understood that Jesus genuinely cared about people. He cares about our needs, our feelings, and he's constantly doing what he can to make our lives better, whether we acknowledge it or not. Jesus never acted selfishly, never took advantage of others, never used his power for his own gain. Jesus is different. He's the exact opposite from what we usually find with people who have power and authority. And so Mary goes to Jesus probably because he's the oldest son and we don't read about Joseph in this story, or maybe it's because she had watched him grow up. And maybe this is her way of saying, hey, today's the time. Now would be a really good time for you to publicly declare who you are. But whatever her reason is, Mary goes to Jesus because she knew that he would care. And then she just leaves it in his hands. She says, you take care of it. She goes back to her hostess duties, confident that Jesus would handle the situation, which he does. Jesus uses this problem to do something amazing. The miracle that takes place happens in the context of a human problem. Jesus enters into the mess of humanity and becomes the solution, which is the reason so many of us came to follow Jesus in the first place. We had our own problem. We realized that we needed help. And just like Mary, we looked for Jesus to find the help that only he can give. Mary demonstrates for us that we can bring Jesus into our struggle with faith and belief. She realized there was a problem. She gave the problem to Jesus. She trusted him to take care of it. And then she just walked away from the problem. She stopped worrying about it because she knew Jesus was in control and that he loved these people enough to take care of it. In verse 6, we find out that there are these 6 stone jars. They're used for Jewish purification. These are more than just large clay pots. They held water that was used to wash hands and feet and all of the utensils that would have been used during the wedding ceremony. Most families had at least one stone jar where they would store their water and they could dip out what they needed to clean. Each of these jars held between 20 and 30 gallons. And so, at the very least, we're looking at 120 gallons of water. Jesus tells the servants, fill the jars to the brim. And then he does something weird. He instructs them to dip the water out and take it to the master of ceremonies. Now, I'm going to be honest. If I was a servant, I would have probably had my doubts. I mean, I don't know if you've ever thought about how difficult this must have been for the servants. It's one thing to fill up the jars. I mean, that's probably a part of their regular responsibilities, but you would have never taken a drink from the water in those jars. It would have been like drinking the water from the back of a commode. Nobody ever drinks out of the back of that water closet. They must have wondered, how in the world is the master of this feast going to react when he finds out we're giving him dirty water and not wine? I mean, when he finds out, he's not going to be a happy camper. And if he ever finds out where the water came from, he's going to be furious. But to their credit, they obeyed. They did exactly like they were told. And we read that the master was stunned. He even says, everybody begins with the best wine, and yet after the guests have had their fill, they bring out the cheap stuff. But for whatever reason, you've saved the best until now. Usually when I'm reading and studying during the week, I find an article that leads to another article that leads to another article, and I just end up chasing rabbits. Most of the stuff that I end up reading is pointless, and I never use it. But this week, I stumbled across an article that really caught my attention. It was written by Dr. Jim Williams, who is a professor at Indiana University. I want to share with you what he writes. He says, Now, you may not realize how miraculous it was to turn water into wine. The liquid had to go from chemically simple to chemically complex. Water does not have the correct atoms to make wine. Those sugars, alcohols, aromatic compounds, and colors contain much more carbon and nitrogen than you will ever find in water. In order for the flavor, the color, the texture of the liquid to be sensed by the steward as good wine, there must have been new atoms formed within those jars. That is, the miracle of water to wine must involve the creation of new carbon atoms, new nitrogen atoms, and a number of other elements, such as a rather large amount of potassium. So, what he's saying is that when Jesus changed the water to wine, he does so much more than just kind of rearrange the atoms that are already present in the water. He creates something new in those pots. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. Oxygen never becomes carbon. Hydrogen never becomes nitrogen. That doesn't just happen. Atoms don't just change their organic compounds. Yet, once again, we find a story that's been told since the beginning of time. Jesus shows up. He creates something out of nothing. When Jesus enters the situation, possibilities that were unheard of just a few moments ago become possible. Isn't that the way it always turns out? I mean, we do the very best that we can, and then as a last-ditch effort, we finally turn to God, and things go from adequate to best, to better than we could have ever imagined. When the wine runs out, it seems like this hopeless situation. I mean, where do you get more wine? You can't just run down to the local grocery store and buy some more wine. It takes days to produce. It's obvious that the newlyweds are in jeopardy of breaking those strong laws of hospitality. They're going to be humiliated. They're going to be disgraced. I mean, this situation is going to define their family for generations. And yet, once again, we find our leader, Jesus, showing up and turning a hopeless situation into hope. By turning water into wine, Jesus lavishly blesses the groom and rescues him from a crisis. He not only saves him from shame and a potentially huge debt, he provides for him beyond what he could have ever dreamed or imagined. The majority of the people just thought the groom was being overly generous. But behind the scenes, it was Jesus who was being generous. I mean, think for a moment about the groom. Somebody comes up and whispers in your ear, there's 120 gallons of the finest wine that this little community has ever tasted, and you know you had nothing to do with that. That right there is why I follow Jesus. Jesus is still in the business of changing lives. He's still working to help us make sense of our struggles, and it's through him we find the opportunity to live a life of transformation. Jesus is not your usual leader. I mean, you've noticed that when people come into power, they tend to get self-focused, right? They use their money, their voice, their platform to expand their power and their bank account. They're driven by their own personal agendas. People that they're supposed to be serving become nothing more than a means to advance their own lavish lifestyle. And yet the first miracle sets the pattern for everything else Jesus will accomplish. This is just an ordinary wedding in a little bitty town with common ordinary people. I mean, the bride and the groom aren't even mentioned by name because nobody would know who they are anyway. And I think that's the point. Because most of us are insignificant people, at least as far as the world is concerned. Yet God still longs to be involved in our lives. While the world may never know our name, we might never be airport famous, we have a creator and a redeemer that knows us intimately, knows the number of hairs on our head. Jesus is willing to leave the glory of heaven to lay down his power and authority to come and serve the lost, broken, downtrodden. I believe Paul says it much better than I do in 2 Corinthians 5:21, where he says that God made him who had no sin to become sin so that we might become his righteousness. This is the great exchange. We're sinful. separated from God, dying in our sin. Much like the newlyweds, we have this problem that is too big for us to fix or even address. And so Christ comes on the scene, takes away our sin, takes away our separation, takes away our death, puts all of that on his shoulders so that we can become the righteous children of God. Jesus uses his power and his authority to serve us and to make sure that we receive the offer of eternal life. The sinless Savior becomes sin so that we might become acceptable and in a right relationship with God. That's why Jesus is fit to be your leader. We go to the table this morning as a physical reminder of what God offers us through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We take the bread and the cup in an act of joyful celebration because this is our wedding feast. Much like the groom and the bride, it's at the table that we realize how deeply blessed we are. We remember that we've been invited by the eternal King to come and follow where he leads. And so we go to the table to hear the invitation and to make the decision. Are we willing to claim Jesus as our leader? And I think that decision makes all the difference in the world. And so this morning, as you go to the table, it's my hope and prayer that you're able to have an honest conversation with the people that you are blessed to be with today. That you're able to talk about what it is that makes Jesus best suited to lead. And what is it going to take for you to follow Jesus to the point that you love him so much you're willing to invite others to come and know him as well. I hope you have a wonderful time around the table. Never forget how deeply loved you are. Have a great week. I hope to see you very soon.